of the many things I've learned this spring at Garrison, kind of 5 particularly memorable ones. First, I will recall in the very first, the Climate, Mind, and Behavior, there was this fascinating moment where it was an all-star panel, need not be named, of 3 50-something white guys, very prominent in our field, doing this, and there had been a couple of depressing events recently in the news, and they were offering up a riveting and compelling, certainly to me, in my own kind of 50-something white guy way, narrative about just how bad things are and just how big our challenges are. I was completely taken by this panel. I was perfectly happy to get right in that slipstream. But I also noticed, and it became very evident during the Q&A, didn't take any kind of, noticing, that among the 30-somethings in the room, there was this rise that took on this narrative. And basically the bottom line of that, and I'm getting too deeply into these points, and I won't do it for the other 4, the bottom line of that was that if we're talking about persuasion, and if we're talking about building a movement, nobody wants to join a movement that's miserable, right? Nobody wants to join a movement that's scared. And even if you are, think about a way to process that through. It was very memorable to me. Second, what games teach us. One of the things I've heard is that one of the things that games teach us is that the problem with the programmable thermostat is not just that it's too complicated, but that it's also not fun, right? That people need to engage in game-like behaviors with much of the technology. They have to have interfaces that teach you how to play. They have to generate visible status, as well as some of the competition that we've been talking about. Third, and this was from my colleague, my urban sustainability colleague, Sadhu Johnson, who used this very memorable line, which for me is a terrific expansion of the idea of hyperbolic discounting, a useful example of hyperbolic discounting, which is when he said, we tend to overestimate what we can do in 1 year and underestimate what we can do in 10 years. I thought that was a very useful guiding concept. Fourth, I learned that opt-out is not just about inertia, but also about the assumption that the opt-out default implies a social norm, and that its power comes from that as well as from the kind of inertia default that would have occurred to somebody like me. And lastly, fifthly, this whole idea that behavior changes attitudes at least as much as vice versa, which to me, I think takes on the phrasing of habituation trumps instruction. These 5 ideas are helping to inform the kind of research agenda that we're starting to build at the hub, at GPIC. DOE launched a national competition. I suspect some of you are involved in other consortia. You are all now welcome to participate in the one that happened to get chosen. Here's some of the goals and missions. Here's the 10-county region in Pennsylvania and New Jersey that is the boundary area, the market area of the hub. We're focused on existing buildings. We're focused on small to medium-sized commercial buildings, including institutional multifamily housing. And it is all about a set of goals and metrics like these that are about driving down the price of commercial retrofit with some ambitious metrics over the course of the next 5 to 10 years and transforming the market. Where's Dennis? The whole idea is to transform that market. I'm going to move quickly through all this. Here's the one. I intend this to be a graphic, not something that you can read. These are all of the institutions who are involved in the hub. I count 7 or 8 who are in this room. Now, some of these deals, some of these memoranda of understanding probably happen at some kind of a sea level. Some of you may not even be aware, right? But the invitation here is that these members, these stakeholder groups, and these partners come together for applied research, for demonstration and deployment. There are funds available to assist in that demonstration and deployment phase. One of the things that's already occurred is the DOE is beginning to align some of the deployment and demonstration activities out of the national labs with the opportunities that are available at the Philadelphia Navy Yard in this test bed idea. But it goes far beyond some of the commercialization opportunities represented by the research coming out of the national labs. It has to include, and currently does, and this is an expansive invitation, it has to include the kind of work that you all are doing as well. I'm going to leave this one up here, talk about a couple of ideas not embedded in this PowerPoint. Talked about the test bed. Second, it's important to note what's going on here regarding the DOE funding opportunity. The funding theory of the problem that was brilliantly, for my money, articulated in the FOA and the RFP from DOE is that rather than attempt a national research agenda or solution on the problem of commercial building retrofit, that what you have to do is pick your poison. You have to pick a region. You have to pick the given building stock, the given climate, the given set of regulatory and other market structures in that region, invest deeply in solving the problem, or getting traction on the problem, and frankly, worry later about portability. It's a very different kind of, it's a Michael Porter, right, competitive advantage of regions, understanding inter-industry linkages and so on, the particularities of buildings and all the things that define the building context is an explicit part of this funding theory. And that's the commitment. So we have a 5-year commitment from DOE to try to transform this market in a particular place and bound our research agenda by the conditions of these 10 counties. It doesn't matter what happens elsewhere. Can we do it here? There are reasons why doing it here, I like to call it the advantages of backwardness in Philadelphia. There are reasons, if you can do it here, you really can kind of do it anywhere. One quick example, largely because it's illustrative. We're one of 3 states in the United States that requires the separation of prime contract bidding for any project involving public dollars. So basically making integrated design impossible to do, right? So we have a legislative environment in which some of the key principles by which you might attempt to achieve some of these things are particularly difficult in this region. Secondly, or thirdly, this is very much a startup. Again, I've talked about this, I won't expand on this point now, but it's very open-ended. I've got a great Einstein story to use to make this point, but I'm not going to tell it to you. So, now, I'm going to conclude with these 3, and I'm going to just really label these ideas now. Some of the illustrative work that we're about. I lead the policy, markets, and behavior research effort at the Hub. Right? There are 10 universities and corporations who are involved in about a $3 million a year effort over these 5 years on this set of issues with access to much larger funds for this deployment research. We're the only team, to my knowledge, that has a motto, which I'm going to give to you, and because I'm such a dork, that motto is in Latin. So the motto is planto is imitabilis, planto is vilis, tunc planto is mandatum. My translation of that is make it hipper, make it cheaper, then make it mandatory. And this motto captures much of the way we're organizing the work. The order matters and the realms matter. It's about behavior, right? It's about market pricing and driving that pricing down and recognizing some of the things that prop up the price. And it is ultimately, and I think much more comfortable with this than many of the colleagues in this room, is also ultimately about stepping up and making it mandatory. I think Jonathan's very helpful list of 7, it includes nudge and steer and so on, it's not really a list, it's a cycle. And it begins with number 1, regulation and mandatory, and it ends with cultural norm changing, but his example, importantly, tellingly, accurately of that norm change is the mandatory anti-smoking ordinance in New York City, right? This really is a cycle of these kinds of things, and that our willingness to step up and make mandatory certain kinds of regulatory interventions is absolutely critical. And that the problem is not figuring out when you can do that, the problem is figuring out how you build a constituency for next generation regulation that transforms the magic wand of a mandatory solution into a hammer, into something that is actually workable. And you can build constituencies with leadership and with engagement for those kinds of interventions. Secondly, the theme overarching in the work of GPIC is integration. Right? Many of you are aware of the way the fragmented building industry in this country, rather uniquely around the world when compared with East Asia and Europe and so on. Much of what we're trying to do is integrated design, which has to do with tools and process, integrated delivery, which has to do with the industry structure, and so on. So we have different kinds of, and one last example too about integration. Some talk about deep retrofits. We talk about integrated retrofits. It has a very strong engineering component, but one of the things we mean, and it refers to an earlier conversation, about the dimension over which these retrofits have to be integrated is time. We recognize that on planet Earth, many of these retrofits within buildings are gonna axo, right? They're gonna separate out over time. And part of what we need to do is think about the ways in which the components and their integration into systems with some uncertainty about time can make predictable possibilities for integrating 6 months from now and 2 years from now. And that's a design challenge, but also the way we finance these things, so that both financing and technology can assume this stuff. And I'm going to wrap up with this, which is that the last thing is that, you know, for a math guy, of course, integration, right, the analogy is moving from discrete to continuous. So that much of what we're trying to do is support the move from discrete interventions to continuous ones now. Many examples of this, like continuous commissioning and so on. I'm going to give you 2 sentences and then stop about another example. And it's at the heart of much of what we've been talking about today with the role of information, the challenges and activities related to data acquisition on green buildings, and so on. Thinking about the ways in which we can move from feedback to creating customer demand to creating building owner value by making more continuous the kinds of ways in which we now use information. The example being, instead of point of sale kinds of audits and disclosures, building labeling, right, that moves to a much more continuous kind of representation, and moving, frankly, from even the discrete idea of a building label to a much more active idea where the building itself is reporting in a visible way its performance, and creating legible market value for owners and prospective owners of those buildings. And thinking about the ways in which technology is making things that would have been very difficult 5 years ago, pretty trivial 5 years from now. And thinking about that continuous use of information, not just for its own sake, but as a market maker, in terms of asset value, capitalization, in terms of connecting it to property taxation, and so on. So I'm going to stop with that. Yeah, I had 2 jokes. I'm not going to tell either of them.
Jokes at dinner. Jokes at dinner.
Jokes at dinner. Okay. All right. So thank you very much for your attention. And please, please, please seek me or any of our colleagues out to talk more about what we might do together.
Mark, thank you very much.